Hello, well in this video I've got various chores to do, some thinning out, some pricking out and some potting on. The first thing I'm going to be looking at are these pots of carrots. So these were sowed some weeks ago and germination has been really rather good. So there are more plants in this pot than I really need. So I want to get these spaced out to, I don't know, maybe 1.5 inches apart. These are Amsterdam forcing and they will produce quite a long thin carrot. I can always thin them a little bit more later on when there's a small bit of root that we could harvest. But to start with, I want to get these separated a little bit so that they can grow on better. So the first thing I'm going to do is give these a drop of water. That will help when I'm trying to pull the roots out. Some of these I'll be able to grab with my fingers, but where they're close together, a pair of tweezers is quite handy, especially if you've got rather chunky fingers like I've got. So now I'm in one of the cold frames and I'm looking at these rows of cima de rapa seedlings. Now I really need to have at least a couple of inches between them at this stage. So I'm just going to thin these out some more. Now I will have to thin these further later on, but maybe take every other one out, but it's always a good idea to leave just a few extras in place in case some are lost to pest damage. This is a fast growing variety of cima de rapa, so it doesn't make plants of anywhere near the size of the slower growing sort, so I won't have to thin these too much. So that should do for this area. I shall carry on now and do the same for the rest of the frame. So I've got my tray of cut and come again lettuce here. Now this also needs to be thinned out. I probably need to take out every other plant here to give them plenty of space to grow. But rather than just discard all of those plants, I thought I would try and take a few out with some root on and pot them on into these. Well, I think I got some pansies or something in these last year, so they're rather flimsy, but rather than throw them away, I shall make use of them. So we'll pop them up into these cells and grow them on for a bit. Later on, get them out into the bed somewhere. So that's a couple of trays of the young lettuce seedlings pricked out. Now ideally I should have done this at least a week ago when they were a bit smaller. This is at this stage it's a little bit brutal and undoubtedly disturbs some of their neighbours. All I'm going to do now is just go through this and pick out a few plants where it's still a little bit crowded. So I've just given that a drop of water to settle any soil I've disturbed around the roots of the remaining plants. And they've got a little bit more room now to develop. It won't be too long before I'll be able to take a first cutting of this. So here I've got a tray of the chard and brassicas that I sowed a couple of weeks ago. Now, one of these cabbages, Brunswick, was a bit slow to get going, so that one's not ready, but I think these others are probably in a fit state to pot on. So you might just be able to make out there's a network of fine roots there. Now I could plant this straight out into one of the beds and I'm sure that would be absolutely fine. What I usually do though is just pot these on and I will grow them onto a slightly more substantial plant before I put them in the ground. And that way I think they might be, if anything, a little less troubled by pests. Right, so all I'm doing is filling a pot, making a suitable sized hole. Then I can drop the plug in, and I'm going to put that fairly deep with the seed leaves resting on the top of the soil. And I'll water that in. So I'm just going to carry on and pot up the rest of this tray. I'll leave the Brunswick to grow on for another couple of weeks until they've caught up. But the chard, the red drumhead cabbage, the Portuguese and dwarf green curled kale, they can all be potted up in the same sort of way. And then when I get to plant these out, there'll be hopefully more robust plants that can stand up to the abuse that they might get outdoors. So I've got these small pots of parsley that I sowed a few weeks ago. Now the first true leaves are coming out and this is a reasonable time to move these on. So I'm actually going to knock these out of the pot and then I'll split them up and move them onto these cells. So these are quite a reasonable size, they can grow on for quite a while in there. I'll just gently untangle the root system and then just poke it down into these holes. I always think transplanting like this is a little bit brutal, but the plants seem to manage okay. So our chilies, peppers and aubergines are doing quite well, and these are in 7 centimetre pots. I use these small square pots because they stack very well in the propagators, and propagator space is always a precious resource. But I think it's probably time that I potted on some of the larger specimens. I'll leave the smaller ones to carry on in their small pots. I'm going to have to be careful and a little bit selective to make sure that I don't run out of space where I can keep these warm. These are actually quite nice looking plants. I'm just going to tap out one of these and have a look at the roots. So yeah, there are lots of fine roots in this pot, so I think they're okay at the moment, but I wouldn't want to leave them in here for too much longer before moving them on. So I'm going to pick out the best looking and largest specimens and pot them up. So that's a pretty good sized pot. I'll be able to leave them in there now until I put them into their final positions. That will either be in one of the greenhouse beds or then possibly into larger pots, 7.5 to 10 litres, probably 10 litres. There's a nice collection of brassicas potted up, and then there's the chard and parsley. Now I sowed some more brassicas just a few days ago, so I'll have broccoli, calabrese, cauliflower and more kale to pot on in a few weeks' time. And I've potted up the first 16 of the sweet pepper plants. Now the sun's going down now, so I'll have to return to these and finish them off tomorrow. Now of course it's still really early in the gardening calendar, and I know that many people, especially if they're living further north, won't really have got underway yet, and that's perfectly all right. We're only in the middle of March and there's tons of time yet to get going. But here in the south we can hopefully, with a bit of luck, get a head start on the season with some early sowings. But there always comes that moment when the workload begins to ramp up, and it's very easy in the start of the year when you're just sowing, and you know you can sow dozens of seeds in no time at all. But as soon as you get to the point where you have to start thinning out, pricking out, potting on, then the workload really ramps up, and I can already, even though we're only at mid-March, I can already feel that ramping up of the garden workload. So I'll have to concentrate a bit to try and keep on top of it. I'm not the best at planning out my garden calendar. This year, for the first time, I've produced a little spreadsheet with all the varieties on and the approximate times that I want to sow them. It's not down to the day, but it's down to the half month. So whether I want to sow something in early March or late March, that's all marked out on the spreadsheet, and I'm hoping that's going to help me to keep up with the sowing, because it's sort of late spring when there's quite a lot of crops that have been sown, and many of them are getting into the ground, when it's all too easy to lose track of what to sow when, and then you get to late in the autumn and you haven't got crops to follow on. So I'm not always great at doing that, but this year I'm hoping the spreadsheet is going to keep me on track. Anyway, that is all for this video, so thanks ever so much for watching, and bye for now.